You're listening to a special presentation from Night of the Living podcast, Zoned Out with Freddie and Joe. All the time I want and all the time I need. Poor Burgess Meredith. Time enough at last.
Oh, such a show, such a episode.
Yeah, we were saying last time that this pairs really well with The Lonely. So if you haven't listened to that episode about The Lonely, maybe check that out.
Yeah. Yeah, where do we even begin with this? It's got so much
it's a deep
history.
One. Yeah.
Yeah.
This
definitely
is one of my top 5 Twilight Zone episodes, including like all Twilight Zone series, the movie and everything. I love this episode.
Yeah.
Air date November 20th, 1959. This was also Rod Serling's very favorite episode, which I thought was kind of interesting because it's so simple.
That is interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, it's John Bram. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I imagine he likes the simplicity of the message, but we'll get to that. There's a piece of this that I'm like, it sticks in my craw. So
good.
we'll discuss later. Yeah.
I think what too is it like we were kind of hinting at last time is this is the beginning of him letting the bird fly, letting it out of its cage where he's like, okay, I'm going to work with some new people. And It works out so damn well. John Brown, the director, he ends up doing 12 episodes. The others were Judgment in season 1, Judgment Night, The Four of Us Are Dying, Mirror Image, and A Nice Place to Visit. He comes back for season 2 with Mr. Dingle the Strong, where they pair him back up with Burgess Meredith for a really fun episode, which we had mentioned Mr. Dingle the Strong before in that the idea became one of the episodes we already discussed. And now for some reason I'm drawing a blank on which one it was.
It was the last one. It was The Lonely.
Well, no, but Mr. Dingle, remember Mr. Dingle the Strong is where he has all the power.
Oh, you're right. Isn't that One for the Angels?
No,
it's Escape
Clause. Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's episode 6.
So Mr. Dingle the Strong came out of Escape Clause. It was a different version of that story. It was the funny, more lighthearted side of it with a kinder kind of character. But then he did Shadow Play. Again, I'm talking about the director here, John Bram. From season 2. Then in 3, he does Person or Persons Unknown, Young Man's Fancy. Season 4, the New Exhibit, and season 5, You Drive and Queen of the Nile. So pretty prolific within the Twilight Zone. And he was awarded the Directors Guild Award for this episode.
Gotcha.
And also, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Joe.
I was just gonna say that's a pretty epic amount of involvement, and it's interesting because there's so many of the later seasons that I don't think I've ever seen.
Oh, this is going to be really fun to get into those.
Totally.
They're mostly, I think the Twilight Zone is almost mostly good throughout. There's very few weak links, but, so this is also the first time Rod Serling went in and adapted somebody else's story. That was Lynn Venable, who she is still alive and living in a retirement home in California.
Wow.
There are a lot of original creatives who were in directors writing positions on the Twilight Zone that are still around. So this again is a cast of 6 like last week, including Serling. I would say, the one other change, the new composer. We've been dealing with Bernard Herrmann this whole time. So they bring in Leith Stevens, who did the War of the Worlds soundtrack and 92 other credits. But this is the only episode he'll ever work on, and I feel like he's kind of just doing Bernard Herrmann's style anyway.
Sure.
So it's consistent with what we've seen so far. There's no big change. It still feels like the Twilight Zone.
Well, and hopefully that's an example of where one composer looks at what the other one has done and said, "Well, I'm not going to change it wholesale. I'm gonna do a variation. I'm gonna do my twist on that."
Yeah.
Rather than starting over.
Fits right in.
Yeah. Oh man. So this stands out to me as, this is one of those episodes that everybody recognizes. If you see any clip about the Twilight Zone, if you see a mention of it or you talk about it, this is the one that everybody quotes as like, "Oh, I remember that episode." Even if they haven't necessarily watched the episode, they know the twist, they know what's going on, and for good reason, it stands out.
Yeah, I really sympathize with this character, Henry Bemis, Burgess
Yeah.
Meredith's character. I was a bank teller once too, and
Oh yeah, yeah.
yeah, and I can tell you, it's mind numbing. You know, I mean, there are times when it would be exciting, like if you're involved in somebody try to perpetrate a crime on you or something. Yeah,
Right, right.
those would be kind of more exciting. But the idea of this character who is just, you know, miserable at home, and then
Yeah.
also he goes into work where it's the only place he can kind of sneak reading, which is the only thing he really cares about.
Yes, yes. Before we jump into all that, let's talk about Burgess Meredith,
Yeah.
who's just he's just fantastic. He's one of those people who I think that if you met him in person, you'd be like, what an amazing, interesting, fascinating person. Obviously passed away now. But he had a really distinctive, raspy voice. And for those who don't know who we're talking about, he was probably one of his earlier roles that people know was he was on the old Batman TV show. I remember him from that
Yeah.
in the 60s playing the Penguin.
Penguin. Yeah.
Um, and then he's probably most well known from being Mickey, the kind of grizzled old boxing trainer from the Rocky movies. This is all from IMDb. And two of his last credits toward the end of his life were for Grumpy Old Men and Grumpier Old Men, which, hey, there's the Minnesota connection.
Those are
Um,
fun movies.
yeah, I haven't seen them, but I've heard a lot about them, and they were really kind of well known at their time.
Yeah.
Um,
I wonder if they hold up. I haven't seen them since they were new.
right, right.
Yeah. He was
Um,
also Amon in the Clash of the Titans. Kind of he was kind
oh
of
yeah,
he was like Mickey to was it Achilles? No. Who was it in that?
no.
I can't remember now who
Oh,
Harry
somebody's
Hamlin
yelling.
was.
Somebody's yelling at their pod or
Perseus.
their headphones right now. Perseus, thank you.
Yeah. But he was he plays that character great. There's something about his voice.
Yeah, it's very distinctive.
Yeah.
And he actually did lots of cartoon characters, just like Ted Knight from last week. Just kind of was well known for the voice that he put out there. And so yeah, so
Oh,
he
I'm
go ahead.
sorry. There was something I forgot. I forgot to do this. I found his final credit, his very final credit, Burgess Meredith. It was in 1996. It was a full motion video game. Do you ever play it? Have you ever played any of those where it's live action? Like Night Trap was
It's like
the first.
Yeah, it's like clips interspersed with a game, right?
Yeah, and you're choosing how the story evolves, but it's him and Christopher Walken and Karen Allen, and it's called Ripper. And I guess it's some sort of murder mystery or something. But I found it I found footage from it on YouTube, and I meant to watch it before we started recording. But I would just encourage people who are interested in Burgess Meredith's career and some of the quirkier things that kind of happens towards the end of a really long career. I would say that this Ripper game I had never heard about it at all. And I was really surprised because of the cast in it.
Well, and full motion video games, for those who aren't familiar, fill a really weird niche between when you could play video games in the 80s, Galaga and, Dig Dug and stuff like that, and when you could play video games in the modern era where you can actually see a rendered cutscene of video with polygons and, all the actual computer animation. It was like that combination of like, well, we want to have video in a game, but you can't interact with it. It's just like you're essentially clicking on something that's going to trigger a video to play, right?
Right.
And so you're kind of navigating through a story, and depending on how you navigate through that story, a video clip would come up and you'd have to, decide what you're going to do next. So it was kind of an odd place, and people didn't know what to do with the genre. Like Night Trap is the one you talk about, and it's well known because, well, it was controversial because it had murder in it and Dana Plato.
Yeah,
and
and they went after it.
Yeah,
I can't remember. No, Tipper Gore I think was part of that push too. It was the same push that went after the explicit lyrics.
Right. And Dana Plato, for those who don't know, was the star of Different Strokes and had a difficult life towards the end of her life, I think, because of all the Hollywood stuff. Anyway, I won't go into it, but do some research, and it's a fascinating story.
You could do a whole. I mean, there probably are documentaries about just the full motion video era.
Yeah.
There's some
Yeah.
great
And
storytelling and mixed in and all that. Like some of it's just
yeah.
real garbage, but then
Yeah.
some of it is really like. And I would imagine with Burgess Meredith and Christopher Walken and Karen Allen, this might have a decent script. I'll have to find out.
Right. Yeah. Well, and it's the opportunity to do something new with a media form,
Yeah.
right? So this is the beginning of like, oh, we can actually put videos into a video game, and um it's something new. And so this was a lot of that early experimentation anyway for what people would do that with cutscenes and all that.
Yeah. I thought that was a fun piece of trivia.
Yeah. Well, anyway, Twilight Zone. So we got Burgess Meredith, who is playing Henry Bemis, and he's right at the beginning. He's helping a customer at a bank teller window, and he's reading a book down in his lap. The camera kind of pans down.
David Copperfield, right? I think.
Yeah, yeah. And he has these huge lenses on his glasses, which is totally foreshadowing.
Yeah.
But they make his eyes look gargantuan,
Like Bubbles
which is very
on Trailer Park Boys.
yeah, right. And it's very distinctive look, which comes into play later, which we'll get to. But he starts describing the book to her, and he's like, and there's this little poor fellow, and his father has passed away, and his mother has married this miserable man named Murdstone. Isn't that a villainous name, Murdstone? And he was so into it, so excited to describe this book to this woman, and she's like, "Just give me my money, you know."
That guy just needed
And
a podcast. If Henry
right?
Bemis had a podcast, he would have been okay.
Absolutely. And he so she's totally not into it, and she's complaining that he shortchanged her again because he wasn't paying attention. And he's kind of nodding because he's not really listening to what she's saying. And then he's like, oh, realized that he needs to do something. He goes, "I'm sorry, Mrs. Chester."
I love that little element of him almost calling her the villain's name from the book
Yes.
he's reading.
Yes, I thought that was so clever. Of like, oh yeah, you slipped that right in there. That was great.
It shows you how he kind of sees the world too.
Yeah, right. He's like he's seeing the archetypes, or he's seeing the people in his stories. And so he gives her the missing money, and then he goes on describing the book to her, like, but this is such a great book, you should really read it. And she goes off in a huff, and then the go ahead.
I just want to tell you a real life connection. Like when we used to have a movie theater near us, it's gone now, but the ticket terror was this young woman in a wheelchair who always had a stack of books almost a foot high sitting on the little podium. And every time we'd go to see a movie, she'd want to talk about the books. And sometimes it would be like really creeping in on the showtime. And we're like, oh, we probably can make it through the credits if we stand here and we'll go in and at least see the movie. But we'd have these super long conversations with her. And she was so into it, it was hard to break away.
Oh,
but it was sweet.
Yeah.
She reminded me of him. Yeah. She reminded me of Henry Bemis a lot.
So cool. And so she goes off in a huff. The president of the bank then comes up behind him as he kind of puts his slate out there to say he's closed. And he just keeps reading the book. And president's like, "I want to talk to you in my office." And it's not until that point. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. I just wanted to say the boss, Mr. Carsville, is Vaughn Taylor, who was the boss in Psycho.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he's the one that Marion Crane took the money. You know, he gives her the money to take to the bank, and she drives off. That guy has 207 credits.
Wow.
But I recognized him, and I was like, oh, what is it? It's Psycho.
That's awesome. It seems like he's probably used to playing that kind of character, too. He's got that kind of boss face, but you can see him use it weaselly later. And what's funny to me, this episode stood out a little bit because they didn't do the intro until now. So they had this whole scene. What do they call that? Like a cold open?
Yeah.
Okay.
Which becomes more common in the series going forward. But yeah, it's another change in this episode. Yeah.
It's like an introduction of the what's going to happen. And then, witness Mr. Henry Bemis, a charter member of the Fraternity of Dreamers, bookish little man whose passion is the printed page, but who is conspired against by a bank president and a wife, and a world full of tongue cluckers and unrelenting hands of the clock. But in just a moment, Mr. Bemis will enter a world without bank presidents or wives or clocks or anything else. He'll have the world all to himself, without anyone. And I thought, Ooh, that's too good of a summary for me to pass up. So, I don't know. I love Rod Serling, and I love his rhythm. You know, his
Oh,
I don't know,
definitely. Yeah.
syncopation, whatever. Yeah. Um. So yeah. So then we get that's the intro, and he's in the office of the president, and the president's like reaming him out for being not a good worker and for being you know what you are? You're a reader. Like like he should be ashamed of himself for reading on his lunch hour
Yeah.
and not being more famous or focused on his bank work. And he threatens to fire him if he keeps like reading on his breaks and stuff. And it's like, that's, I mean, obviously this never fly today.
Yeah.
Mostly because he's just a jerk. And well, I mean, I imagine this still happens for a lot of bosses. It doesn't mean it's right or
It's phones
justified.
now, smartphones.
Right.
You know, like if you ever have to go to a drive-through to get dinner, and the person taking your order is also using their smartphone.
Yeah, exactly.
But they're not reading, you know, Dickens on there.
Right.
Probably not.
Probably not. Maybe.
Could be.
Probably not.
You kind of want to ask. You kind of want to be like, ooh, anything good?
Yeah, right. It could be a way to interplay with that instead of like being like, get off your phone. Just be like, whoa, what you getting slapped back?
Everybody would think you're being a smartass, though. They wouldn't believe you. They wouldn't believe that you really want to know. Because that's the world we live in now.
Right. So insincere.
Yeah.
So he's protesting a little bit slightly. He's like, but and the president's like, what? He said, make it quick and get back to your cage. And I was like, okay, is that a technical term for a bank teller like place? Or is he literally telling him, get in your cage, you know,
I
animal?
think we didn't call them cages, but then again, most of my experience working in branches was I was in what were called bank marts and grocery stores. So it was a different kind of thing. I think they did at one point have teller, like they called them cages, I think. I think that was a banking term. I should know that. I worked in banking for like 25 years.
Well, you're not a banking historian, so
that's right.
I was just curious. But I thought it was kind of symbolic of kind of telling him to go back to his cage. He then explains that his wife won't let him read anymore. And the bank president is kind of smiling this gross, sly grin. And, or not sly, it's more like kind of good turn of the screw kind of grin. And he praises Mr. Bemis's wife for chastising him for reading. And it's just gross, you know, it's just, what a jerk.
You get that one moment of they break it, you know, he has his work day, and then you get that one evening of him with Helen.
Yeah.
And you get the idea. Jacqueline DeWitt, who was in Little Giant with the Abbott and Costello movie.
Okay. I don't know that one.
I really like Abbott and Costello, but I can't remember what the hell happens in that one. I always go back to Frankenstein and all the later goofy black and white monster crossovers with them. But she there's just this sequence with her. She is so awful to him, like just straight up abusive.
Yeah, yeah. And he's you know, the cut to that. Oh, right before that, as he's leaving the bank's president's office, he leans over and sees a piece of paper or like a little article, and he reaches down to start reading it as he's leaving the room. And the bank president's like, "Humph," you know, he's like, oh yeah, sorry.
He's got a serious compulsion. It's uncontrollable. Yes, he can't help it.
He'd be diagnosed as likely OCD at this point, or maybe ADHD or both.
Yeah.
I say that as an ADHD diagnosed person. So as he leaves, it cuts to him at home, and you hear the Henry as she's calling from the other room, and he's like, you know, yes, dear, you know, and she comes into the room, and she yanks the newspaper out of his hands and just starts ripping into him, and it's just like, oh man,
I think
yeah.
I was just gonna say, I just feel like in that scene, as bad as that was, like the moment when he tries to connect with her and offers to read her poems, and she acts like she's into it.
Yes.
That part is what my heart broke for him right then, when he opens that book of poetry and she has vandalized the entire thing.
Well, and it oops. let's build up to that. There's that part where he's uh he's um sorry, my we're our house sitting a cat right now, and
Oh,
it
I
just
thought I saw it.
tipped over a bottle of water all over my desk with all my
Whoops.
computer stuff. So
Do you-
maybe we can just pause for just a brief moment.
yeah, sure. If you want to grab a towel or something, I will pause here.
All right, I'll be
So,
all right.
all cleaned up.
All good. All good.
I was telling
So-
during that quick break where we paused was that it reminded me of the early days of NOTLP where animals would come in the room and knock over everything and unplug stuff and
Oh, I remember the tap dancing dog.
that
and
too. Yeah.
Yeah, so good.
Helen
All
Bemis, though. We were talking about
behind the scenes. Yeah.
this nightmare.
So Helen is digging into him. So she's really awful, and they make her really unlikable. And it's funny because he does a couple of things. I've been reading this book about like relationships and want to be a better partner. And one of the things that they say is when you get into this an argument where there's tension and you're both feeling it, if one of you can lighten it somehow, if you're going to crack a joke or something, it's an opportunity. If you're giving everybody an out to say, hey, can we make this not quite so intense? And he does that. At one point she's like, she says something about, I want you to change shirts, and what kind of a husband are you, and or one of something about that. And he goes, he realizes she spoke in a way that made it sound like she has more than one husband. And he's like, well, how many have you got? It's just me.
Oh yeah, she said no husband of mine. Yeah.
Yeah.
Then they're supposed to play cards with the neighbors that night, right? Like you also get this idea that he's never allowed. And I'm married to someone who has a lot in common with Henry Bemis as far as being a reading addict. And she's deprived herself plenty of times of reading time to do things, with and for other people. And I get how precious that is to him. And it really bothered me a lot the way that he is blocked at every turn. He can't get any satisfaction at all.
Right. And so she's like, she comes right back from his attempt at a joke with a smackdown. So she says, we're going to do this. Go get ready. She steps out for a moment, and he digs a book out from underneath a cushion where he's clearly like secreted it away and tucks it into his coat. Like, okay, well, I'll bring this, and at least I'll have this while I'm there. And he gets to the door, and she's like, Henry, what are you doing? And he's like, well, nothing. She's like, do you have something? And she clearly knows he's grabbed this book. And then she turns, and you're like, you see her mood change. She's like, would you like to read that to me? And like you said, it's like, oh, that's it. Wait, what's going on here? Because that's something feels wrong, right? And he immediately is like, oh, I would love to read with you. Oh, that would be wonderful. Like he's so excited. You can see the joy, like, oh, she accepts me. She's okay with this. Oh, I'm actually going to get to read to her. I'm so, happy. And they sit down, and he opens the book, and like you said, it's vandalized. It's all hashed out and blocked out. And he's like, Helen, who did this, Helen? And she goes, who do you think did it, Henry? You should thank me, really. A grown man who reads silly, ridiculous, nonsensical doggerel. And he's like, this isn't doggerel. There's some very beautiful things in here. And she's like, I say it's doggerel. I also say it's a waste of time. And she grabs the book and just shreds it. She tears it apart, and he's like, Helen, don't do that. Please don't do that. And he leans over to get the scraps that she's kind of thrown down. And his glasses fall off. Foreshadowing. And he puts them back on, and he's like, why, Helen? Why do you do these things? He's just at a loss of like, what's. And she's like, because I'm married to a fool. And
so sad.
It's just mean.
Yeah. I had a school teacher do the same thing to me with a comic book when I was a kid.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, she didn't scribble on it, but she tore it up in front of me, threw it in the garbage.
She tore it? Oh my.
Yeah. It was like a Spider-Man, or maybe I think it was like a Spider-Man comic when I was a kid. Oh. I was reading it in class. She tore it up.
So my oldest kid was a heavy reader when she was in elementary school, and she had a habit of finishing her homework or the work in class fast so she could read, right? And so it was literally like, when you see the old joke of somebody having a book, but then they have like a magazine or something
Yeah.
inside it. She would do that with another, like a school book, and she would have an actual another book inside of it that she was reading. And this is third grade, and her teacher was like, "Well, she's not on task and she's not focused." And it's like, she did the work already. She's done. Now she's reading.
Yeah.
Why is that a problem?
There's some teachers have weird control issues, I think.
Totally,
They
totally.
feel if they give an inch, the class will take over
Yeah.
and then they'll
And
be
it's like,
railroaded.
so I don't know. It made me think of that, and yeah, they made her a very despicable character.
Yeah.
And thankfully, that's kind of the last we see of her. So,
That's all you need.
yeah. So we cut to Bemis taking his lunch break again at the bank, and he sneaks down to the vault to read in peace and closing the vault door behind himself, which I gotta imagine that's something you don't really do.
It's not
Um,
safe if you get locked in.
yeah,
I mean, you would never think with a bunch of other people in the building that you'd get locked in the vault, but who knows?
right, right. So he clips to him. He's finished reading a book with a contented sigh. He's in his happy place, and he picks up the newspaper and flaps it open. And the headline is right across the screen: "H bomb capable of total destruction." And he looks down a moment later to see his book flip open and his pocket watch glass crack and then explode out. And then there's an enormous explosion that like rocks the whole scene. And he tries to stand up and falls down and passes out. And it goes to a commercial break.
This moment, the flip of I always thought it was kind of weirdly, it felt supernatural when the book page flips. Because he's
Yeah.
in a bank vault. There's no crosswind or anything in those places. Ventilation isn't great, and you're like, well, what? It's just so dramatic. It's such an interesting choice to be like, the page has got to flip right at the moment.
Yeah.
Really good
I
punctuation.
wonder. Yeah. Well, and it really, and I wondered if there was something about what it was going to flip to or something like that. And it wasn't, especially. It was just that it flipped open. I think that was supposed to imply the shockwave,
Yeah, that makes sense.
the sudden shock of atoms shifting with that giant explosion. But it was something that happened just before the sound. And so it was far enough away that, you start to kind of construct this scene in your brain of what's going on outside. And an H-bomb has exploded, which I went and found out a little bit more about H-bomb versus like the original. So the H-bombs were like the second generation of nuclear weapons. So they were considered thermonuclear weapons. And this was like, they don't use this kind of, wouldn't use this kind of stuff now, but it was like that, the evolution of what comes next for an even bigger explosion. And scary stuff if you ever drill down into that.
Yeah, I used to, when we would read about that stuff in school, it would freak me the hell out, because if you're like the Reagan era, especially,
Oh, yeah.
we'd come home, and he'd be on TV, and we were always waiting for nukes from Russia to fall from the sky and stuff.
Right.
So I think it's probably about the time I saw this episode, we were under, it was like things were heating up.
Yeah.
In the world anyway,
Right. Well, end of the 50s, heading into the 60s. Yeah, that's.
Well, I mean even in the 80s as kids, like
sure.
when we were, we were constantly worried about nuclear war with Russia. And,
Yeah.
I'm amazed that we've gotten over that, I think, in a lot of ways, where it was just on the news every night, I felt like, when we were kids.
When there was a constant tension, and it wasn't a constant tension the same way. I mean, I've talked to my dad, who's 30 years older than me, and he talks about they used to do drills in school, duck and cover. You'd get underneath your desk like that was going to make any difference. But it wasn't about physical safety. It was about psychological safety.
Yeah.
Which is mind blowing to think about, like the fact that they were doing things to help people feel like if something was happening, they weren't completely helpless,
right.
Which they were ultimately.
It's a way of maintaining order too.
Yeah. Right.
Like a desk is going to protect you from the H-bomb.
I'm not going to step into a very, very dangerous and sticky trap and compare that to anything in modern day, because I think there's a lot of conspiracy theories about things like that. And I don't want to perpetuate that, but it's one of those things that makes you think about what's behind it. So, yeah, we're gonna sidestep that and go on with the story. So, he wakes up and slowly leaves the vault, and his glasses are crooked, and then you see a POV from his perspective, and everything's blurry. Again, foreshadowing. And he straightens his glasses, and the building is just smoldering ruins. And there's like rubble everywhere and broken timbers, and he starts walking through things. He kind of navigates up the stairs and looks in the president's office, and he hears the president's voice, the bank president's voice. And he looks over, and this I thought was kind of shocking. They show the bank president's hand from underneath some wood, just the hand, and it's was holding a dictation machine where he's talking about what he's going to do that night, and then the dictation machine kind of sparks and stops.
Yeah, he's telling his
And
secretary to type everything up in triplicate.
yeah, exactly.
Like, well, I guess she's off the hook.
And so he's kind of staggers back, and he's stunned by that, and he's walking around, and he walks out of the bank, which again, a bank is going to be usually fairly well built and solid structure, and everything's just gone. It's a wasteland, and it looks like, you know, what you see those photos of German cities at the end of World War II, where it's just there's nothing left. It's just barely any structures or anything.
Even off into the distance, because they give him a long vanishing point too, like in the backdrop, which I presume was some sort of painting, and or I don't know if they shot it where they had that depth of, you know, of emptiness behind them. I don't know where they would have shot it that looked like that, but it was unsettling that you're like, oh, okay, there's nothing within sight.
Yeah, yeah, and it looks like, you know, almost the surface of Mars or something. And there's actually, it's funny, there's a scene later where you can tell that it's a matte painting in the behind, but you can tell now. And I bet if it was on broadcast TV, you think of the resolution of the TVs and all that sort of stuff, you probably couldn't tell at all. It looked really realistic.
Oh, back then,
but now, yeah, right, because now we have the clarity of the actual film in high definition and all that, so you can tell more. But
I'm a huge fan of matte paintings, backdrops.
Oh, it's amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah. To really look for them, and when you see it and you go, wow, I did not notice that before.
It's neat when if you've ever seen any of the originals where they paint them on glass and
oh no,
and the layers. Oh, it's really cool. Like they did a lot of work like that on the movie Clue. I think there was like layers of matte paintings on glass to create like the surroundings of that mansion. And
really,
yeah, it's good stuff, man. It's good.
I'll have to watch out for that.
I love it. If anybody who knows any great matte painting works, I'm always interested in seeing them.
That's super cool.
Feels like pure fantasy, you know?
Yeah. Well, and then the evolution of that too. I know there was in the anime film Akira.
Oh yeah.
There's a scene in there that people have reviewed. If you go search for it on YouTube, where there's like 4 different layers of motion and things happening, of things moving in the background. That was like an incredibly complex scene, but you don't think of that when you look at it. It just looks like they're panning to the side and the traffic's going this fast and the person walking's going this fast. And it turns out that was like, you know, months of work to animate just those few cells.
Well, if you're a Disney fan at all, they invented the multi-plane camera, right? Like for, I think, Snow White. Not 100% sure if that's right. It was an early Disney work. But like that idea of having like this piece of glass is the skyline with the sun beating down, and this piece of glass are the trees, and this piece of glass are characters, and then there's a piece of glass that's the foreground where there's rocks and whatever in the foreground, and choosing what's animated, because like you were saying, you might want to animate, you know, at least the character level of that multi-plane has got to be somewhat animated to have some movement. And like you're saying with Akira, they really went over deep and they animated every level of like a multi-plane. I think that's why that movie was so hugely successful, like critically.
Well, you can watch it today, and it's a hardcore storyline, but the art looks as beautiful today as it
Yeah.
did then. It's unbelievable,
And
way ahead of its time.
it wasn't CGI, I don't think at any point either.
No, I don't
Like
think
I
so.
think it
And
was all handmade.
yeah. So anyway, um, we're looking at this scene, and this is another one where, as he's stumbling around, there's a montage scene, kind of like last week with the lonely, and there's another voiceover. Except this voiceover is another one of those mid-episode voiceovers by Serling, and he says, "Seconds, minutes, hours. They crawl by on hands and knees for Mr. Henry Bemis, who looks for a spark in the ashes of a dead world. A telephone connected to nothingness, a neighborhood bar, a movie, a baseball diamond, a hardware store. The mailbox that was once his house is now a rubble. They lie at his feet as battered monuments to what was but is no more. What was but is no more. Mr. Henry Bemis on an 8-hour tour of a graveyard." It's like,
Yeah.
ooh,
Spooky.
8-hour tour of a graveyard.
Yeah. Him stumbling around and debating on whether he wants to live in this new world or not, and determining that he has enough food to last. He has everything he needs, but he's so bored
Yeah,
when he's,
yeah.
and I'm a former smoker. So I was just watching him like just smoking and sitting in that rubble. And I was like, that's probably if the world ended how I would end up. I'd start smoking again. And I would sit in rubble and just fall asleep with lit cigarettes. And,
Yeah.
you know,
When Yeah, when he monologues just before that to reveal like how he survived. He's like, "They're all dead. They must be. Everybody's dead except me. I'm all right. Why I'm all right?" And he's like talking to himself like you would, you know. And I was right. I was right down in the middle of the vault. I was down in the vault. That's why I'm alive. I went down in the thing of it is though. I'm not sure that I want to be alive, you know?
yeah,
So,
that monologue's good. He susses it all out, and it's like you could come back from the commercial break and not have seen the beginning, be like, oh, okay, I think I
yeah,
kind of just get the gist of what's happening here.
yeah.
And him eventually, damn. I was telling Joe before we started recording, I get notifications on some things and I cannot seem to stop them. So you might have heard that, but him finally finding, I don't know if this was the library, right? Is
Well,
the idea?
yeah, and before that, he's found the food. He knows he can eat. He knows he can smoke, whatever. And he falls asleep, wakes up again, and it's interesting because I had forgotten this kind of interplay part where he gets into a car and he's trying to start it, and he's like, "Oh, a car!" And he's like latching onto these things of normalcy that are missing, which again harkens back to the lonely from last week of like trying to find something normal in this weird place, desolate place. And he's like, "Is this how it's going to be? Reading the same half of a newspaper over and over and over again?" And he finds the car, then he gets out of the car and he starts rationalizing that he's kind of going back and forth. You can see he's kind of having a nervous breakdown. He's like, "I've never had so much solitude, and how fortunate it is. Oh, it's really great fortunate. It's really great fortunate. Help, help!" And he's freaking out, and he goes running and stumbles into a cabinet that has a gun in it, and he's like, "Okay." He reaches down, he picks up a gun, and he's like, "If only there was something to do, something to do." And as he raises the gun to his head, pretty extreme, his glasses, you see him focus in on the public library that he's now stumbled into and right in front of the public library. And he's like, "Oh."
So he's sorting through the debris of the public library and has stacked up everything he wants to read around him on the
Yes. And he's got him
steps.
for like months and years. He's like got it all planned out. So clearly he's done some searching through this. You know, we've jumped ahead. And he's like, "And this one is for this next month, and the month after that, and the year after that, and the year after that."
Yeah.
He's
And
so happy.
it feels like the same. It pairs with that moment in last week's episode where the convict and the robot are having the moment where he has totally accepted her as like his companion and he's finally ready to move forward with his life.
Right, right. There's a moment of like, oh, everything's gonna be okay, and he goes, oh, and the very best thing of all, that there's time now. There's all the time I need and all the time I want. Time, time, time. Oh, there's time enough at last.
Super famous quote.
Yes.
Almost every time anybody does something about the Twilight Zone, that quote's included for a good reason.
And then the moment he leans over to grab the first book and he stumbles and his glasses fall off onto the steps and the lenses shatter.
Yep. For you kids out there, they used to make glasses out of glass.
And remember, he's got these thick Coke bottle glasses, so he can't just pick up some cheaters somewhere. Like,
Right.
these are special glasses.
Yeah.
And he picks them up. Go ahead.
I'm just gonna say I thought it was funny in the IMDb trivia, someone who knew enough about how lenses work broke down his form of farsightedness was so extreme that it'd be impossible for him to ever hold a book far enough away to actually focus on it or close enough, so he was really just blind.
Oh,
But I never really thought about it. They were like, they're convex lenses. So this person, I guess, was an optometrist probably.
that's interesting.
Yeah.
That went to that level. I love that when people dig into it, like, reality, what's going on here? It's like, no, that would be awful.
Right. I don't need that. If myself, I thought it was a fun aside, but I'm like, it's enough for me to know he's blind. I'm like, okay, I get the point. He broke his glasses. He can't see. But they're like,
Exactly.
I guess enough people were like, well, I break my glasses and I just got to hold a book a foot away from my face and I'm fine.
Right.
Not the case
So
for this character.
He holds them up and he's like grabbing at the pieces as they fall out of the lenses, and then he comes the epic line, "It's not fair. It's not fair at all. It was time now. It was all the time I needed. That's not fair. That's not fair." He starts sobbing. And then the outro kicks in. The best laid plans of mice and men. And Henry Bemis, the small man in the glasses, who wanted nothing but time. Henry Bemis, now just a part of a smashed landscape, just a piece of the rubble, just a fragment of what a man has deemed to himself. Mr. Henry Bemis in the Twilight Zone. I messed it up. A fragment of what a man has deeded to himself. So as a fragment of what man has deeded to himself, that's actually a reference back to a lot of the language symbolism around the bomb, and we're condemning ourselves to death by having atomic weapons. So
True. Still true. To this day. I also thought thematically it's interesting how these last couple episodes make me wonder, like, how far out did he plan when they started making this series? Like, did he know when he got to these episodes they were going to be these specific stories? Because if not, if it happened organically as part of working through the Twilight Zone, it kind of makes you wonder if he's attracted to stories about a guy who got everything he wanted, but was still somehow either left longing or punished for it somehow. And I'm wondering if that is at all reaction to, because later on, I know Serling had a hard time working with the network. And I'm curious to see, how that theme evolves through the 5 seasons or whatever we have ahead of us here. It just struck an interesting chord because I know he was unhappy for a number of years near the end of the series.
yeah.
Yeah. So could be. I think it's got to be something in him that's attracted to that story type.
Yeah. Well, and the fact that this is his favorite to me stands out as a little bit of a masochistic streak. To me, like, this, what sticks in my craw, and it always has, is like, it's not fair.
Yeah.
It really isn't fair. Like, this guy has been kind and thoughtful, and he's, it's kind of like the bully winning in the end, which I won't make any connections to modern political events, but it's like the bully winning, and you're like, no, that's not how it's supposed to be. That's not the happy ending. That sucks, and it really just literally isn't fair. And it could be, on the cosmic level of like, well, the universe doesn't care, or it could be on that basic level of like, well, tough luck.
Or it's the Twilight Zone is cruelly ironic. like as an entity, as the way Rod Serling. But also on the flip side of that, stuff like One for the Angels is so sweet, you know, and it has a happy ending. Like, you know, really these dark endings, I feel like they really started with last week's episode.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. Well, in this one, well, and like it's a twist, but you can almost even look into that one and go, well, he was being punished, so this is his just punishment, right? This one is just like, nah, we're going to beat up on this guy and then give him hope. And then we're going to pull out the rug from underneath him and punch him in the gut. You know,
Yeah. It's like The Mist, like the movie version of The Mist.
Which I've never seen, but I've seen like the what you're talking about.
Yeah.
And, oof.
Similar vibe.
Yeah. Yeah. Or Seven. If you've ever seen Seven.
Too.
Yeah. We won't spoil those, but man, that's just like sadness upon sadness. And then you leave the movie and you're like, I enjoyed that.
I really did enjoy The Mist.
Yeah, I actually haven't seen that one. I've definitely seen Seven, but I've never watched The Mist or read it.
The book's great too. The book is a very different ending though. But I was so taken aback by the ending of The Mist that I couldn't like argue with the fact that I was like, wow, that was really effective.
Right.
You know? Which reminded me of Rod Serling, so I can't fault it because, you know, if my favorite TV show of all time did it to me multiple times, I'm probably gonna like it other places as long as it's not too mean.
I think on a personal flavor, like I like, you know, I'm all for desolate and terrible and dark stories, but I like it with just a touch, or at least leave it a mystery. Like Cormac McCarthy's The Road.
I've never read that one. I know it's bad. I mean, sad.
If you listen to the audiobook, there's a movie obviously with it too. But the audiobook is fantastic, which reach out to your local library. They have a whole collection of library audiobooks you can get in addition to digital books and real books. So shout out to the library. It's so dark. And then at the end, it's kind of like, well, there might be hope, but it doesn't promise anything. Right. And I favor that even over this ending of like, nah, he's screwed. Like, oh.
Yeah. It just, it's because he never had happiness, it seems. He never had it even before. And it was just going to be his one shot. And even that didn't work out. Poor bastard.
Right.
Poor bastard. Henry Bemis.
If you're you know, you believe that there's some religious philosophies too of believing like you're never going to be without, you know, the sin, you're never going to be happy, or you can't ever be quite happy. And I don't know, there's some levels of that some people believe in. And I can't do that.
I feel like this episode influenced Matt Groening with The Simpsons and some of Life in Hell. Like he likes to comically put these kind of characters, sad sack characters, in really bad situations for comic purposes, but also it gives you that feeling of Henry Bemis and the Broken Glasses. Example would be like when they were bringing homeless people to the elementary school, and I think it was a Treehouse of Terror, just to murder them, but they were luring them with promises of a hot meal. And that's The Simpsons, you know? I remember thinking, I'm like, okay, that's kind of the dark sense of humor. I think a lot of us grew up watching the Twilight Zone I think you develop a bit of a dark sense of humor around the irony in these endings. And when things really work out unfairly, you kind of have to laugh.
Is the Twilight Zone the origin of Gen X? Are we embittered and jaded because of the Twilight Zone?
I think it reinforced a lot of things. It is funny because like I don't know how many kids are growing up watching the Twilight Zone now. I doubt many, because it does feel like it was a product of syndication for us.
Right.
And it was one of the few choices that we really had. It was a great choice. It was a great option.
Right.
But it was really about limited options, because how many kids are going to want to watch a black and white TV show like this now when they have so many alternatives they could be doing anything else? I think it's hard to get, you know, kids who are, for me, this was like, once you're about 10 years old, I think the Twilight Zone is perfect.
Yeah.
You know, like it's awesome.
Well, and it's so thought provoking. It's so like makes you think. And if you're paying attention, it's always something that's gonna leave you going, oh, how do I feel about that? What do I want to think about that? People have opinions about it.
Yeah.
You can always can always realign to like, oh, what do you think? Well, I took this perspective, or I took this perspective. It provokes conversations, which
Yeah.
I think is the point of the entire series, is like get people talking and thinking.
Yeah, much like Star Trek. I think they belong together in that it was somebody who was admittedly left of center for the most part on both cases. I think progressive, creative people, and trying to just get people to talk about issues and in a different way,
Right.
and that's like the best of sci-fi. That's what it was meant
Yeah.
for, I think.
Yeah.
Speculative stuff. Because if something doesn't work, if you need a robot to be a character, you can make a robot a character and it can serve whatever purpose you
Yep.
want. But if you're writing realistically, like we're not quite there yet,
And that's why we're doing this series, right?
Yeah.
Love it.
Yeah, this stands as still as one of my top 5, I think. Definitely. And I couldn't even tell the difference with the new composer. Like we were talking, I know we talked about it last week. I don't know if we mentioned it this time, but yeah, it still feels consistent with everything we've seen so far, even with new creative partners. So,
right. So they're definitely holding that the theme of the show, or the feel of the show, is consistent.
Yeah. Next week, I can't remember do you remember what's next week?
Yeah. Perchance to Dream is
yeah.
the next week.
Yeah.
And I don't remember this one, so I'll be excited to.
I think it's the one where the guy can't sleep.
Ooh.
If I remember right. Yeah. He has to stay awake. I can't remember exactly. I think it's it's because he has a really bad nightmare and he's concerned that his heart will fail if he goes to sleep.
Ooh.
Yeah. Ooh.
Spooky.
Well, thanks, Joe. I don't have anything else to say about Time Enough at Last. I figured we talked 52 minutes about a 20-minute episode of television again. So
I think that's time enough.
all right. Thanks, man. We'll see you guys next week.
Thank you. Bye.